Welcome. Today's date, the 28th of May 2024, marks the anniversary in which in 2022 Dylan Rounds was murdered by the hands of James Brenner. Today, I wanted to look over the latest news and responses from such as the family, like the mother Candice Cooley, and what she had to say, in addition to set the story as to what originally unfolded in the name of the Dylan Rounds case, so people who are new to it, seeing it for the first time, understand what truly went down with the original story and not the altered one which many people portrayed within the community. In addition, we'll be taking a look at a map analysis to look back at the burial spot to try and understand how come Dylan Rounds wasn't found sooner, considering they had the equipment in order to locate him. With that being said, it's time to begin. One of the first prominent dates that showed up within the Dylan Rounds case at the beginning when the family were trying to make sense of everything was the 25th of May 2022, in which Dylan Rounds was still alive at that point, leading up to his disappearance. Dylan Rounds was driving down Tacoma Road on the 25th of May, in which he stumbled across Chase Venstra, supposedly for the first time. Now, previously in the past, Dylan Rounds, unknown to him, Chase Venstra's son was working for Dylan, but this time round, Dylan came face to face with the father, Chase, who was on a gravelled roadway laying by the side, supposedly bruised and possibly covered in blood. Why did that happen to Chase? Well, supposedly Chase Venstra got in trouble earlier on in the day with a rancher and a rancher's wife and was beaten up and driven out, threatened with police intervention. So Chase was trying to lay low in bushes, which is a little bit odd, but the location, anything happens out there. Dylan Rounds picked up Chase Venstra and gave him a lift back to wherever he needed to go. When Candice Cooley heard about it on the day, Dylan Rounds didn't tell Candice Cooley the full story and lied to her about not picking him up, but that was done to prevent any arguments from escalating, and Candice Cooley understood that much later on. The next key date that appeared in the timeline was the 26th and the 27th of May, in which Dylan Rounds was in Montello at the time, across the border from Lucin, Utah. Montello was a small town based in Nevada with a low population. The last transaction by Dylan's card was noted on the 26th, and when Dylan Rounds was last seen and heard from witnesses and friends, was on the 27th. For example, around 10 a.m. in the morning on the 27th, Dylan Rounds was supposedly seen outside of one of the bars in Montello known as Saddle Sore Bar and was speaking to Kurt Wadsworth, a friend, and Taylina, the daughter of Kurt Wadsworth. Upon Dylan Rounds being busy on the day as well, prior to that, being busy with custom farm work which lasted roughly 6 weeks or so, Dylan Rounds was almost completing those tasks and chores along the way. Dylan had to supposedly fetch parts and pieces for some farmer out there, and once he got that done, later into the night of Friday, the 27th, Dylan Rounds made it back to his farm in Lucin, Utah to finalise and finish off some work he needed to do at his own farm. Although late into the night, Dylan Rounds was a passionate young farmer at the time, 19 years old, had a dream and was very determined to make it work. Whilst Dylan Rounds was doing his farm work late at night, there were some campers, witnesses near to Little Pigeon Mountains who oversaw the farm and tractor lights being on, who later reached out to Candice Cooley in a handwritten letter via Facebook to let her know what they saw. So that confirmation, the timestamp being 11:30 p.m. running to roughly 11:45 p.m. in which Dylan was doing his work. After that, he went to sleep. Now take in mind, Dylan Rounds did not live in Lucin, Utah, but he did own a farm and was 50-50 with his grandfather, Larry Rounds. But when work needed to be done on the farm, Dylan Rounds would stay there for maybe a couple of days. Though, with Memorial Day weekend coming by, on the 28th of May, with the weather, the rain coming on in, Dylan Rounds didn't have much time to do any farm work. That's why he did it the night before, last minute. All Dylan Rounds could do on the 28th was protect his seed by parking his grain truck from his farm and taking it down to a grain shed property, which is 5 miles away, somewhat west. It just so happens that the grain shed property, there was a supposed squatter by the name of James Brenner that was living there in his own trailer. And that was the beginning of the end for Dylan Rounds. In the morning of the 28th of May 2022, Dylan Rounds got up in the morning time, possibly awoken by rain, as the witnesses nearby camping at Little Pigeon Mountains reported it was raining pretty heavy in the morning time. Now, Dylan's grain truck did have a sheaf over it to protect the seeds, but it wouldn't have been enough to keep it dry due to the saturation over time. So Dylan Rounds got into his grain truck, drove it down to the grain shed property. Now, the grain shed property did have a north gate in which Dylan Rounds was able to access, but before going on through it, Dylan made a call to his grandmother, Karen Rounds, at 6:51 a.m. roughly, to tell her what he was going to do, and also telling her he would report back later and call back, though Dylan never did. And later, that's what sparked the worry within the family, and it started to spread from there. But just after 6:51 a.m., Dylan attempted to make a call to James Brenner, who was at the grain shed property, at 6:58 a.m. Now, it's unknown as to why Dylan Rounds was calling Brenner, and it's unknown as to what it could have resulted in if Brenner did pick up the call. Could it have at least alerted Brenner as to what was happening? Could Brenner have been in a better, more welcoming mood if he knew what Dylan Rounds was planning on doing? I guess we'll never know. Where the next phone ping of Dylan Rounds' phone was at roughly 7:03 a.m. near to the grain shed, which would make sense as Dylan was trying to park the grain truck in the grain shed. Then, the next phone ping was at 7:27 a.m. The way that was proven was through a time-lapse video that was recovered from Dylan Rounds' phone much later on, around November time of 2022, in which it actually showed Brenner in possession of Dylan's phone inside of the trailer. Brenner was seen cleaning a firearm, as well as blood being on his shirt, on his hands and sleeves. Very questionable, a great deal of foul play. Now, as said, that footage was retrieved much later on in the case when the family were already anticipating the death of Dylan Rounds, foul play being involved, and James Brenner being responsible. But in terms of the actual order of how things played out on the 28th, that's the way I've worded it, just so you know. So it's presumed that within roughly that 30-minute period of Dylan Rounds making it down to the grain shed property, and then at 7:27, Brenner being in possession of Dylan's phone with blood on him, in which that shirt did have DNA of Dylan on it, it was obvious as to what happened to Dylan within that 30-minute period. That's when he was murdered. As for when he was disposed of, either later on in the day of the 28th, when there was phone activity movement in possession of Brenner, or the following day, all day on Sunday, to relocate Dylan's body. Now, the next phone ping and timestamp that occurred after the death of Dylan Rounds was at 7:43 a.m, in which just after that, then the phone was on the move down to Dylan's farm. With Dylan being dead by now and Brenner in possession of the phone, Brenner took a trip down to Dylan's farm. It's kind of unknown as to why, but it could tie in as to why the key fob was missing from Dylan, but also why the door was locked and the seat adjusted from Dylan's pickup truck when the family got down there days later and investigated. Was Dylan's pickup truck used in the disposal of Dylan Rounds? That's kind of unknown. Nevertheless, whilst Brenner was down at Dylan's farm on the 28th, in the morning time, there for about 30 minutes, searching about, maybe, and then the phone pinging back at Brenner's trailer at around 8:03 a.m. So Brenner made it back and then just remained there for most of the time until just after lunchtime, maybe around 1:30 p.m. That's when there was movement. And then the final phone ping of Dylan Rounds' phone in the possession of Brenner was at 3:51 p.m. near to Lucin Pond, in which, as time passed by within the case, Around June 18th or so, that's when authorities led to Lucin Pond and came across Dylan Round's phone dumped within. So it's confirmed that on the 28th of May, after the death of Dylan Rounds, getting into the afternoon, Brenner did take a trip down to Lucin Pond to dispose of Dylan's phone. So I guess Dylan wouldn't be tracked or traced anymore, and if there was any detail or evidence on that phone, it would be destroyed. Now clearly Brenner underestimated that, but at the time he thought he did a good enough job. As for Brenner's shirt that was seen in that time-lapse footage though, he didn't make a smart decision there. He left it stuffed in his trailer, in which when authorities came down later on in the case, they came across it, retrieved it, and confirmed it was linked within the death of Dylan Rounds with the DNA found on it. The same with the boots as well. Fingerprints, touch-based DNA found on the boots, in which Brenner got hold of them from Dylan on the 28th, which is a bit questionable as to why you would take them off. Maybe if you're pulling the body, possibly. But those boots were discarded at the dirt mound, and that was later found by the family when they came down there on the 30th of May. But that's roughly the timestamps and how events unfolded regarding Dylan Rounds from the 25th to the 28th. And you could ask yourself, why did Brenner go down to the pond to dispose of the phone? Because it just so happened to be around the time of when Brenner was going round to Don Hatley's place on the same day in the afternoon for a barbecue, because of it being Memorial Day weekend, to celebrate that. And the same with the people in Montello, Nevada, that town, having their barbecues over that way. Now, just a bit of a backstory. Dylan Rounds was invited to go down to Montello on that day for the barbecue and celebrations, but Dylan turned it down because he was more focused on his farming. So that really does put it into perspective. It just happened for Dylan, unfortunately, wrong place, wrong time. Now, it could seem a bit odd how a person trying to park a grain truck in a grain shed would lead to death. Well, as a brief backstory, Brenner has repeated offences of violence, harming and hurting people with time, and as well shooting individuals, such as a work dispute, Maryland, before the 2000s, in which Brenner shot an individual. Now, it didn't result in death, but it could have done. Fast forward to 2022, it just so happened history repeated itself, but this time it was fatal. Now, to fast forward ahead, it was later confirmed that Dylan Rounds was shot in the skull multiple times, as the autopsy reports detailed. Now, you may wonder, that's such a jump. Well, don't worry, because a few small details popped up before that to lead to that eventual outcome. So, after the 28th of May, the 29th, the grandmother Karen Rounds reached out to Don Hatley, the friend of Brenner, in which Don Hatley, being a longtime friend of the Rounds' grandparents, Karen reached out to Don just for Don to search about and look for Dylan, because they were worried and concerned because Karen did not hear from Dylan, even though Dylan said he was going to respond back to her later on the 28th. And because of that radio silence, Karen got concerned. So Don searched about, supposedly, along with Brenner. No reports of finding Dylan. Then you fast forward to around the 30th, when the family of Dylan Rounds, Candice Cooley, were in agreement, consensus that none have heard from Dylan. That radio silence must mean Dylan's in trouble. Something may have happened to him, maybe a farming incident. On the 30th, Candice Cooley, Justin Rounds, the parents, made their way down to Dylan's farm, and on the way, Candice Cooley reported Dylan Rounds as missing. Once they got there, they investigated Dylan's farm. Justin Rounds, the father, broke into Dylan's truck to look for clues. No indication of a gun. The truck being locked, which was unusual, considering it supposedly was normally left unlocked by Dylan. The key fob being missing as well. Why did they disappear? Well, when you look back now with what we know, when Brenner was down there on the 28th, one thing could link to another there, right? And as well, with Dylan Rounds on the 28th being at the Grainshed property, with the autopsy report, besides being shot multiple times, supposedly it was with his own firearm. And that being truly the case, well, Dylan being armed at the time, with that being his grain truck or holstered on the side of him, Brenner getting a hold of that and taking one item away from Dylan, along with the key fob, it would make sense as to why Brenner was then able to get down to the farm and enter from there and check about if he needed to steal items or for things to be used against the disposing of Dylan Rounds. You never know. But When the family, on the 30th roughly, made their way to the Grangeshed property to look for further clues, they noticed and came across Dylan Round's boots near to the dirt mound chucked behind. Now, the original story when Brenner was confronted eventually when the search and rescue, when the police came on down not long after the 30th. Brenner responded by saying how he found Dylan's boots and didn't think he would be back after doing all that custom farm work, so Brenner took them by himself and put them near to his trailer. But in the end, they were disposed of near the dirt mound, so there was small indications that Brenner was lying early on, which then set in the suspicion that Brenner was responsible. And as well, Brenner being the only person and last person to actually see Dylan, because the only person that's at the Grangeshed property living now is Brenner, and Dylan was the only one that was visiting on the day. So it was a one-on-one encounter, whether it be an ambush or a one-on-one dispute, which then led to violence. Who knows? But fast forwarding on, the 31st of May is when the friend of Dylan back in Montello, known as Kurt Wadsworth, became influenced by a supposed ex-girlfriend who's a psychic reader that Dylan Rounds was actually held hostage, captured in Montello, Nevada by the likes of Chase Venstra and Robert Aviles. Kurt Wadsworth did contact the police and the family about that tip-off, and it did get the attention of them, so they all went down to Montello to investigate. Unfortunately, it was a false lead, wasted time, in some ways interpreted as a possible decoy, because it just so happened on the 1st, followed by the 2nd of June, that's when the gun and key fob was returned back on separate days. And this marked the beginning of when the BS, the misinformation, came on in by certain individuals. For example, in no particular order, these are a range of culprits who were responsible for causing trouble or enabling or creating misinformation or even spreading gossip or even using poor language and wording to turn a theory and idea into a fact. A range of misfits responsible for harming the case in one way or another and causing mass confusion within the community, some of which acted like cults and others just simply acting as if they are the saviour of the cases whilst also causing trouble at the same time. Problematic individuals in which some of them even attacked me when I was simply covering the case. Now, I couldn't find a page or paper big enough to include everybody's names, okay? Take that into mind. Whilst some of these, or most of these, are creators, as you see on screen, there were many community members and audience members that came from these channels, past and present. Those that need to know their role, know their place, where they came from. Those that have moved on since onto other cases and act like angels now, like a clean slate, as if nothing ever happened from the past. But humans need to remember, in case history repeats itself again, and we don't want other cases damaged out there. But just as a little introduction, so you're aware, on the left-hand side, top left, is the Shack Lady, an individual that claimed to be an expert within the case and just in general of life, many roles, many things done and achieved, whatnot. Talked quite a lot as well, did many live streams early on and for many hours worth talking about the case, but at the same time spending maybe 30 minutes to an hour talking about the case, and then the remainder 5 to 6 hours was talking about pure nonsense, despite the title of her videos supposedly being all about Dylan Rounds. The Shack Lady at times merging with the likes of Jim Terry and later Bob Farrell, enabling misinformation, spreading confusion and poor language and wording. The Shack Lady being responsible, for example, the hole in the Grangeshed knowing insider information that some kind of biological matter was found there, yet it was never confirmed by the family nor the police or in any official reports as evidence, etc. The Shack Lady was also one of the catalysts for spreading confusion and misinformation of a second backhoe with absolutely no proof or evidence, just saying that it was used in the disposing of Dylan Rounds and that there was blood found on the back end, the bucket spade area. As an honourable mention, it would be Earthworm Infotainment, Lance Kelly, who also assisted in that, in spreading that confusion and odd information despite not backing up with evidence, claiming to know the identity of who's responsible behind it, who owns it, but never revealing it, nor was it ever brought up or nor was there a development in the case of Dylan Rounds. So the shack lady did cause trouble, did cause confusion, and also enabled misinformation at times, such as inviting Bob Farrell onto her panel, in which Bob Farrell then talked about Dylan Rounds being in a horse box, kidnapped by Chase Venstra, Robert Aviles, and saying that Dylan Rounds accidentally hung himself, and the shack lady almost being in agreement of it. Very troublesome that. Shack lady at times was merging with Salty Pancakes and Jim Terry, stuck in the middle of it when it came to the case, trying not to choose a side, being on the fence, trying to be neutral, but eventually choosing a particular side and switching and changing like how you do with a pair of underpants over time. There wasn't any clean sheets in town because the shack lady was always changing it up, and as well in terms of how she spoke, her language and wording within the case led to a bit of confusion and misinformation at times. When it was just a theory, how she worded it, it was as if it was a fact. So poor communication skills there. If we go to Ty Corbin, what did Ty Corbin do whilst actively searching for Dylan Rounds, like what Earthworm Infotainment did early on? At a point in time, it got to a serious moment where the family, or at least Candice Cooley, requested for people to take a step back whilst the police and the private teams in the background started searching and checking out key places. Now Ty Corbin and Earthworm Infotainment went against the family's, or at least the mother's wishes, and carried on searching, which could have been detrimental to the case had they found something and disrupted it. Though Ty Corbin and Lance Kelly, whether they be in on it together or not, were there at the same place, same time, near to Bald Eagle Mountain on the Nevada side, where they came across a bin bag full of bones, and that led to a wild story and claim being made that maybe the small possibility that this is Dylan Rounds' remains. It didn't lead to anything, but it was unnecessary confusion. Earthworm Infotainment was also responsible for causing a bit of misinformation when it came to supposed claims that there was a convoy of vehicles going to Brenner's former burnt down place a second time round after a first time investigation being conducted and completed as to nothing being found there. But a second time round, could they have found something eventually and found Dylan? No, it was a group of rock collectors or rock hounders that were actually going into the mountain range. So Lance Kelly quickly removed that video, which is somewhat of a positive. At least he took action there. But nevertheless, it was the concept of people searching out there by their own free will, even if the family didn't want that at a certain time, going against wishes. It's kind of been a bit problematic. But the reason why Ty Corbin shows up here as an example of a bit of a disruptor was because he sided with the likes of Jim Terry on and off, whether it be a love-hate relationship, also going at it with Salty Pancakes, more that was based on conflicts, falling outs, tension, etc., building up there, which was brought into the Dylan Rounds community and case, which did no good to the case, and it made a bit of a mockery of Dylan Rounds in a way. But with Jim Terry being another individual, being a bit disruptive in the case and not really helping at times, Ty Corbin siding with that on and off with Ty, and even appearing on Bob's channel. It was a collection, a coalition of misfits switching and changing on and off against allegiances, along with their audience members and community people following in the same tracks, repetitive cycles, fractures within the community, breakdowns in communication, drama within, which wasn't because of the Dylan Rounds case directly, because of other things, disagreements, falling outs, maybe long-term grudges, but it was brought into the case of Dylan Rounds, which made a mockery and a circus show of it. It did no good. As time passed by, eventually, through the years, it did quieten down, but the damage was already done back then. The confusions, the headaches, people were even driven away from the case in the community of Dylan Rounds because how much of a mess it was. But ever since, stability has followed, thankfully. But who else should we mention here? I mean, in addition, Ty Corbin was responsible for gossip and talk about Montello and stating this and that, could be this, could be that could be the location where Dylan Rounds is. And often Ty Corbin was wrong, and Ty Corbin said himself over time, you know what, I could be wrong and I have been wrong in the past. But the talk about gossip of Dylan Rounds or Kurt Wadsworth and falling outs and Brenner and trouble in the past, did it correlate to the outcome of Dylan Rounds? Not exactly. It was just gossip from the past, which caused more confusion with time and clogged up the clarity of the original story of what happened to Dylan and Brenner being responsible. Now, when it comes to the likes of the blonde hair individual on the far right with a distant look slightly confused or perplexed, known as Corey. Corey is one of the main disruptors and originators of a lot of misinformation and BS, pushing and forcing the agenda that Dylan Rounds never made it to the grain shed nor drove there on the 28th and was in fact attacked and killed, for example, at Dylan's farm early in the morning by the likes of Chase Venstra and Robert Aviles being responsible in driving Chase to the spot, there and back, etc. Was it ever backed up with evidence? Absolutely not. It was just what I say goes and everybody must listen to me. Corey was very unhinged at time and became very disruptive and got triggered easily when people didn't agree with her instantaneously. But the likes of Bob Farrell, a bit of a parrot on the side, ended up being easily convinced and manipulated and brainwashed, indoctrinated into believing stuff. And then Bob became the enabler of allowing Corey to spread all that misinformation and BS on the Dylan Rounds case with who was responsible, and that Brenner was a really innocent individual and simply a fall guy, even though, as we know nowadays, Brenner was the one responsible for burying Dylan, for killing Dylan. It's been shown in the court, been shown with the evidence. Nothing been mentioned about Chase since, nothing been mentioned about Aviles either. So it really sets the scene, the original story being somewhat consistent throughout. But then the likes of Corey coming on to streams, comments, panels, adding more information along the way, to the point where it seemed like they were some kind of expert on the case, involved in on it, had inside information, and was going to appear in court or so, as they hinted at. Yeah, that's never happened, and it probably never will. Corey was a troublesome individual and spread a lot of BS. Corey was also the originator of a false story created regarding the 1st and 2nd of June 2022, in which Corey claimed that the key fob and gun weren't taken by Brenner, but in fact taken by Dylan's brother Colton Rounds and Dylan's friend JD, who got there before the family did on the 30th, took it to the grandparents' house, and Larry Rounds cleaned the items down and returned them back later. What a load of rubbish, because Justin Rounds, in which Corey said that's where she got the information from, Justin Rounds outright said in an actual interview on East Idaho News early on within the case, public interview, that the parents, both Justin and Candice, got down there first and noticed items were missing, and then later when JD came on down to check themselves, that's when they found the items were in the trailer, so they were returned before they actually got back there. So it can still tie in with Brenner over the 1st and 2nd of June. And it just so happens that when you look at the details of that time-lapse footage, 7:27 a.m. on the day of Dylan's death, 28th of May 2022, which depicted Brenner cleaning down a firearm, and with the reports in the background that when Dylan Rounds was shot multiple times in the head, it was with Dylan's own firearm which Brenner got a hold of. Well, it really does set the scene there, because if that same firearm used against Dylan, which was his, which was seen in the time-lapse footage of which Brenner was cleaning down, no wonder why, when it was eventually returned back to Dylan's farm, it was cleaned down of evidence, because it literally showed a video of Brenner cleaning it himself. And yet the delusional bat Corey was in complete delusion and denial and really fixated on a certain agenda that Brenner was innocent, Chase Venstra was guilty, and that Dylan never made it down to the grain shed on the day, and that the gun and key fob were taken by friends or family members of Dylan Rounds, which was all a lie and never backed up either. So Corey was a major disruptor, and wherever she may be now could be with some of the other misfits or whoever moving on elsewhere. Corey did no good in the Dylan Rounds case, a bad example of a human for sure. But whilst that was the case, Bob Farrell on the left-hand side of the screen at the bottom was no better as an individual, claiming to care about the Dylan Rounds case and ever since supposedly doing the same, but in between contributing or at least enabling trouble in the case when Bob Farrell allowed the likes of Jim Terry on, when Bob Farrell allowed the likes of Corey to open her mouth, and even Bob was convinced by it, and some of Bob's audience members so delusional that they fell for it and believed in it. You had the likes along the way of Ty Corbyn supporters like Buster Bratimus, a pathetic excuse of a human that caused absolutely no good in the Dylan Rounds case, but definitely caused a lot of disruption, complaints, whinging and whining. As said, there are many named individuals out there, and even with the Pancakes, Salty Pancakes crew, as you see top right corner of the screen where it says SP, as Salty Pancakes, another individual that caused trouble in the case with time, created conspiracies, alt theories that Dylan Rounds never died and that it was all a setup, a crisis actor. It was all pre-planned, and it was driven through a farming simulator of a video game in which Dylan Rounds was playing a farming game with a true crime YouTuber before it all or so. A load of rubbish, codswallop, made absolutely no sense at all. Yet Salty Pancakes, with his erratic changes in behaviour, at first appearing to be interested in the case, exploring, investigating the area of Montello and even the Grainshed property and Dylan Rounds' farm, but then later became a little bit deranged, a bit out of control, and some of his audience members noticed it with time, got attacked themselves for thinking outside of the box and going against him, in which they eventually were driven away, and some still remained, and then others parted ways at a later point. But as I said, people need to know their roles and where they came from so history doesn't repeat itself. Just because we look at creators for most part of it on screen doesn't mean to say that the audience members are innocent, because they were very guilty and part of the culprits as for the disruption and confusion within the case, who supported it, who allowed it, or spread it. So while you had the likes of Corey, the originator of disruption, chaos and trouble, although Jim Terry was troublesome as well, Jim Terry at one point did expose Corey for lies and disruption, which is interesting. But you had some followers along the way easily convinced by Corey's claims and then passed on by Bob, in which that was expressed. The likes of Indiana 59 easily led astray. Tom Evans easily led astray. Fast Eddie easily led astray. And possibly in between you had other miscellaneous dodgy individuals like IYQ2 or Low IQ, who just kept complaining, didn't contribute any good to the channel, just caused more disruption when I was trying to make sense of the case. And a range of other people. I said, there are so many names out there. I do have them roughly at the top of my head as like a list, bullet pointed. But nevertheless, Bob Farrell, returning back to him, whilst covering the case early on, eventually doing some other random stuff and even collaborating with Jim Tay, and then resorting back to Dylan Rounds when things started becoming active again. There was fake accounts created of Bob Farrell, and the family weren't too pleased of that. Misunderstandings there, but nevertheless, Bob Farrell did spiral out of control as well. Meltdowns, left, right and centre, acting in odd ways, idiosyncratic behaviour, bombastic nature, claiming to care about the Dylan Rounds case whilst also enabling misinformation, disruption and corruption within the case by the hands of Corey the Snake, if you want to call that, or the head of the Hydra, and also the audience members along the way pushing the ideas. Bob Farrell pushing the agenda, Bob Farrell going on the Shack Ladies early on, pushing the agenda of Robert Aviles, Chase Venstra, kidnapping Dylan and accidentally strangling him whilst tied up in the horse box, yet no evidence or proof of that. Bob Farrell also convinced that Dylan was taken to some kind of dump in Oakley, Idaho, even though that was never proven, and it wasn't the case in the end. Bob Farrell did say a lot, or at least pass on a lot of information. The problem was he was easily convinced by it, and how he worded it, it was worded as a fact from there on. So Bob Farrell did no one any favours, didn't do Dylan Rounds any favours, nor the family. The Shack Lady, exactly the same, with poor language, communication and wording, easily convinced, easily backing down, yielding, being submissive and being overpowered by another force out there. For example, the likes of Jim Terry, that either created many people out there and their channels, giving them a boost, a heads up to get going on YouTube, etc. Or at least Jim Terry collaborating with other YouTubers for whatever reason because he saw potential in them, and because it was derived and originated from the Dylan Rounds case and people being involved there within the community, it did cause trouble and friction and tension at times, in which at one point everyone was all together like a happy family early on, and then eventually people parted ways, disruption, confusion, complete mess and a shit show. That's what mainly happened. All kinds of details are coming out. Jim Terry was originally the private investigator assigned to the Dylan Rounds case, in which the grandparents assigned him, hired him, without the family, the parents of Dylan Rounds knowing. So they kind of went behind the backs there. Jim Terry did what he did early on, claiming to be a person that was looking into the background of Dylan Rounds to make sense of it, not to search for Dylan. That was how it was worded. And upon what Jim Terry found, or what was claiming that Dylan Rounds was gay and in a gay relationship, the family didn't take too kind to that, and eventually filed a cease and desist order and also sacked Jim Terry from the case. Jim Terry had a bitter taste in his mouth and continued covering the Dylan Rounds case by making calls reaching out to people, locals, Ty Corbin, other people like that, collaborating with Bob Farrell, appearing on the Shack Lady shows, having it out with Salty Pancakes, on and off, all over the place, to the point where, the agenda of Dylan being gay, Kurt Wadsworth being gay for Dylan, etc., cross-dressing, all kinds of weird, odd things which were dragging out the Dylan Rounds case and making it a circus show. Jim Tay, the originator of the gay theory, Bob Farrell relating to it because on his own playlist subscriptions, he was subscribed to an LGBT channel as well, Young White Males, which may have been a self-reflection, some kind of projection aimed towards the Dylan Rounds case because Bob related to it in some way or another, maybe Jim Tay did as well, but really pushing the agenda of Dylan being gay, which was kind of unnecessary, and it didn't lead to anything, and there wasn't enough evidence either, so it was a waste of time. In between, you had other viewers and watchers going in and out of Jim Terry's channel, show and chat, and even Bob Farrell's on and off, such as Joy Perry, a foul-mouthed beep individual that even appeared on my channel, constantly typing in capital letters, almost a personal world record besides Bob Farrell. Broken keyboard or not, may have had a broken back, broke back matrix, just caused a lot of trouble, a lot of disruption within the case, didn't contribute at all, claimed to know a lot, claimed to have recordings, but then also said afterwards that they deleted it all because they passed it on to someone else. So that was a great good that did, absolutely not. Joy Perry, foul mouth, that's all they did on my channel, no contribution, nothing at all, bit of a waste of space. Moved on since, switched and changed allegiances, whatnot, but history can always repeat itself, especially with all these unstable, disease-ridden humans. But I guess it is what it is. Just wanted to put that into perspective so you get an idea of the people with time. And even when it came to Bob Farrell in recent time, Bob Farrell wanting to know the location of Dylan Rounds' burial, whether that be by the hands of Brenner or the new spot where Dylan's been brought home. But Bob Farrell also wanted to take selfies in a fun, degenerative, millennial type Gen Z way. For what? For the trend, to trigger people, or not, for what not. Whether it does happen or not, such odd behaviour like that is like he's digging himself a hole in the Dylan Rounds case. So that's just an example of a group of dysfunctional people. Much more was done or created or said or spread by these type of people and the language that came with it as well, and some of which even had trouble with me, such as Bob Farrell, Ty Corbin making false claims about clickbait on some of my videos, even though that wasn't the case and he had no proof. The Shack Lady doing long paragraphs and memoirs of complete nonsense, whilst being a bit slow behind, almost like a two-hour delay or so on feedback when speaking and talking and typing. Salty Pancakes being absolutely obsessed with Warlight Ref, creating false imitation secondary accounts, alt accounts within the Dylan Rounds case and community. What good did that do? Just create a bit of a mockery, a circus show, and caused many other communities and people to break down in communication because of the misunderstandings between different accounts and fake accounts, painting someone in a bad, negative way. Thankfully, I managed to avoid that for most part of it. But at times when Salty Pancakes claiming to be a victim, claiming to also move on, never following through with that. And whilst claiming to be a victim, yet causing the same trouble in the past, you haven't got a leg to stand on. Bob Farrell playing the age card, the vulnerability card, caused trouble, but then back away when people start attacking him. Now we're supposed to feel sorry for him. Nope, no shit, that's not happening. As for Jim Tay's kind of faded away within the Dylan Rounds case. Still a bit of an agenda here and there with the family, the grudge as well, but not as troublesome anymore. But it's these people that kind of lurk, they come and go, and especially when Dylan Rounds' body was found, people like to make their little announcements, people like to pray and share their honour and, respect for Dylan Rounds, yet these people didn't show respect in the past, such as when the family wanted respect for, staying out of searching just for the time being, or the respect of not spreading the confusion and misinformation and that type of mess. People were quite okay to do that back then. Oh, now people suddenly care? Yeah, inconsistent, two-faced, can't be trusted humans, low quality, low standards, and that applies to audience members as well out there. The next key date within the timeline is when Brenner's friend Don Hatley grassed up on him in regards to firearms being handed over to Don, because at the time, Brenner being a felon and getting in trouble in the past, he could not risk it again. He wasn't allowed to own firearms at the time, And with the police presence swarming on in due to the Dylan Rounds case, Brenner couldn't risk it. So by handing it over to Don Hatley, and then Don possibly realising the serious nature of it, and on top of the Dylan Rounds case at the time, he didn't want to be charged with that, so contacted the FBI and surrendered the items over. Then later, that's when Brenner was taken in on separate, unrelated charges to do with firearms whilst being in possession of them as being a felon. Fast forward onwards, eventually Brenner was charged, and whilst there was some rough patches along the way and bits and bobs of items and evidence collected and a whole lot of gossip and more BS within the community, finally in 2023 of March marked the point where Brenner was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated murder of Dylan Rounds, and a charge of desecration of Dylan's body because of disposing of it. After that, there was a wave of silence because still Dylan Rounds' body hadn't been found then, and there was some talks about plea deals being made. We didn't know the details at the time, but we were told much later on. The plea deals being created in the background, and Brenner supposedly willing to open up and talk, though the actual deal made in what was given in return wasn't worthwhile and too risky, and the possibility that if Brenner was to open up about the location of where he buried Dylan, it would lead to charges being dropped so dramatically it would have been deemed as self-defense and not even murder. Obviously, there'd be no justice there or closure for the family and Dylan. So, certain offers taken off the table, bids rejected. Fast forward to 2024, marking one of the key prominent dates, which was the 9th of April, in which a plea deal was accepted, in which Brenner led authorities to where Dylan Rounds was buried at. It was actually a spot near the west gate of the Grangeshed property on the other side of the fence line, lower down near to a hill. Not exactly out of sight nor far away, but matches Brenner's lazy patterns of how he does things and jobs, half-hearted. Now, as said, there are questions regarding how he wasn't found sooner when searches did take place in the past, but we'll get to that later on in this video. Be sure to stick around. So, the family were able to get closure and bring Dylan Rounds home for once and for all, which was a big positive. But in terms of the plea deal details, it actually led to certain charges being dropped and reduced, one of which was an unrelated gun charge, which we heard about earlier on in the case. One of them was dropped, so there was only 2 charges on Brenner there. As for the desecration of Dylan Rounds' body, burying Dylan, that charge was completely dropped, which was quite shocking. And as for first-degree aggravated murder of Dylan Rounds, that was dropped to second-degree murder, in which Brenner pled guilty to in court around May 15th, 2024. So you see the dates had to start collecting together from 15th of May 2024, and here we are now, the 28th, marking the anniversary, kind of closing in on it, right? I'm sure that's just a coincidence, fam. So with that being a case of Brenner, and with the courts, the appearances, the laws in the background being somewhat limited and falling short in getting full justice for Dylan Rounds, and just trouble along the way, such as with the LE and how they've handled stuff, there's a lot of heavy baggage and criticisms made by such as the family and Candice Cooley for how the case was treated. And along the way, Dylan Rounds' legacy to honour Dylan for justice, for clarity, and to help other families in the future to turn a negative into a positive so other people don't go through what the family of Dylan Rounds had to go through. Things like that were introduced to create more light out of a dark situation. But in terms of the timeline and some of the key dates that stood out, that's roughly how it went. Moving forwards, we look at present day as of 23 hours ago, posted by Candice Cooley in anticipation of honouring Dylan Rounds, the respect shown towards him, keeping his spirit alive and what he was known for, and as well after everything that's happened within the Dylan Rounds case. These are some of the words Candice Cooley had to say. 2 years ago today, our family's life was shattered with just a couple phone calls. all of us asking the same thing. Have you heard from Dylan? As we all rushed to Dylan's farm, we knew something was terribly wrong. Dylan never would have left his crop. Looking back through all we have had to go through, fighting to get help, evidence lost and dismissed, and so much more, I cannot help but think Dylan had a hand in giving us this challenge. Dylan was going to make one hell of a name for himself in the farming world. He was already well on his way at only the age of 19 at the time. Unfortunately, his time was cut short. The challenges we have been through helped show the world what Dylan was capable of and how successful he would have been. So in a way, he still accomplished his goal. We will continue to build the legacy for Dylan that he wanted to build himself through Dylan's legacy. Support, resources, awareness, and sometimes just a friendly voice that knows exactly what you are going through makes all the difference. That is what we strive for. We, with Missing in America Network, to provide. If you know of someone needing help with a missing loved one, please pass along our information. We'll do everything we can. Dylan Rounds Legacy and Missing in America Network as well. There is the Dylan Rounds Etsy store, in which, in memory of Dylan, like sunflowers, things to honour and remember Dylan, farming related stuff, items and clothing, almost like a form of merchandise, but as for the proceeds and money generated, all put towards like charities or non-profit organisations, like with the K9 Task Force unit that were essential in the Dylan Rounds case, finding evidence along the way and being deployed in other cases and other states in which there has been success within the last 3 or 4 months of about 2 people found, and even remains being found as well. It can make a big difference. It's all about turning a negative into a positive. You got a photo of Dylan Rounds there from the past, and then you got like the icon, the badge of Dylan's legacy. Now, as for the other stuff, you got like the likes of Jasmia, who is quite essential in the Dylan Rounds case, the organisation of the Facebook page and how information was passed around, the original story. Highlighting that Dylan's story has touched people all around the world, and his legacy will help people everywhere during a time when they need it most. I'm keeping Dylan's family and friends close in my heart this weekend as they remember and reflect on his remarkable life, young farmer, never forgotten. And then some other people reached out. So whilst we don't have breaking news at this moment in time, because to be honest, we've been exhausted of breaking news in recent time with everything that's followed, now it's like reflecting on, taking a moment at this point, like a pause. But supposedly there is still unfinished business with time, whether it be the state, the laws of Utah, the courts, and how people are charged, the justice system that needs changing and improving, like how Candice Cooley has said, the LE that need looking into too. Candice Cooley has unfinished business with them, considering how they've handled the case. Evidence along the way, in which there was DNA evidence supposedly at the grain shed and elsewhere, which was missed out on. It was found there, but it wasn't taken in or processed, so it eventually just wasted, went away, and that could have been used in addition to all the evidence along the way. But at the end of the day, Dylan Rounds was found, plea deal was made, Brenner was willing to open up. Though arguably not complete justice, because some of the charges being dropped or reduced, it kind of diminishes the actual impact and the serious nature which Brenner had on Dylan and how it impacted the family as well. That can't be forgotten. Whilst we transition onto the map and the area of the burial site where Dylan Rounds was found by authorities by the hands of Brenner, leading them to there, we do need to highlight the question and possible criticism of why was it not successful sooner. Now, yes, you can argue and say, well, without the key, you'll never gain access to the location. And whilst that can be true in other situations, when it comes to the actual location of where Dylan Rounds was found at, not that far away from the grain shed property, a distance of roughly 1 mile from the spot, and 1 mile from the spot to the pond, as you see up there. If we just zoom on in, facing north, you get the idea. There is a fence line there, and there is a gate there on the dirt road, and just off to the left here, slightly on lower ground where there's a bit of a dip, as you see the raised hill, roughly in this area where Dylan Rounds' body burial was at, adjacent to the wash and the railroad tracks on the other side. When facing east, looking down towards the Grangeshed property where Brenner was living at or squatting at. So you can see the directions, the route which could have been taken on the day of the 28th or even on the 29th. It was a temporary burial in between those days. Nevertheless, not that far away, not exactly that remote as it was worded by news articles. And you look at the fence line as well, the perimeter of the Grangeshed property and the land around it, just on the outside. The reason why it's a bit of an issue and why you could give criticism, and it does branch off one of two ways, it's not just, focused down one avenue, is to do with the equipment and the resources available, not by the hands of Candice Cooley, but the other people that came on in. And it branches off one of two ways. Either one, they weren't utilised in the correct area, such as here, despite the flyby, despite full spectral drones which check for soil disturbance exactly for the purpose of checking for buried bodies, and even Cadaver Dog's Bloodhound unit, which had been used on and off throughout the case, possibly, early on delayed Bloodhound by the LE, which was probably detrimental. If that was used, it would have been interesting if it led to a different result or not, because if it did, Dylan would have been found quicker, there would have been justice for Dylan, and the charges as well on Brenner would have been stronger, and none would have been dropped lightly because there was no plea deal. But that never happened, okay? So it's either how the resources were used and where, okay? If they were used poorly, well, that's probably why they didn't find Dylan sooner. If they weren't even used in the correct area, well, then it's obvious as to why. Now, would they have ever been used in this area, this spot? I mean, if they've checked nearby and have checked it many times and they didn't quite hit the nail on the head, they may have just ruled it out as we've already checked the spot, whilst overlooking a few centimetres worth of undiscovered land or uninvestigated land, if you want to put it like that. Now, there is a bit of an extract, I believe word for word, which was reposted by a viewer on his channel from a previous article in 2023, I believe, when the Diesel brothers and Heavy D ended up going down to Lucin, Utah, who were able to pilot a drone in which money was raised to get hold of it, which was then passed on to Texas EquiSearch later. But whilst Texas EquiSearch were deployed where they're based on, I believe in a different state, different location, Heavy D stepped on in to use the drone, operate it, to take photos, and then pass that on to Texas EquiSearch to analyse the photos for soil disturbance and check if there's any possible locations. We never heard back from them, unlikely because they never found anything. If they did, Dylan would have been found way back then, but that wasn't the case. Let me just show you the quick extract now to really put things into perspective. It reads, "The drone, the full spectral drone, is equipped with a special lens that will take pictures to be sent back to EquiSearch to be analysed," in quotes. If Dylan Rounds was killed and if his body was buried out here, this has the ability to pick up on soil disturbances and anything that a cadaver could penetrate in the ground around it, said Dave Sparks, also known as Heavy D. In fact, this technology is so potent that the federal government banned it for a while. There had to be a court ruling basically saying, no, this is helpful, this is good, go use it. The Rounds family and the Diesel brothers searched the land surrounding the property where Dylan's truck and bloodied boots were found. So, the Grangeshed property, the land, the surrounding property. So the land that's on, what would you call it? The property of the land which is surrounding the Grangeshed property. So anything on the other side of the fence line, I guess, isn't a part of it. So you could excuse them and say that, with the drone being used, if they used it near to the fence line perimeter but not past the point, that's probably why they didn't find that one spot like a needle in the haystack. But let's be realistic. Let's just reread how much it's been hyped up. The full spectral drone, equipped with a special lens, takes photos and can be analysed. And that if Dylan was killed and if his body was buried out there, which was the case, maybe a bit over the land because it was on the other side of the fence line, but still very nearby, 1 mile away from the Grangeshed property. It says that the drone has the ability to pick up on soil disturbances and anything that cadaver dogs could penetrate in the ground, and that's from an aerial view, maybe with a 360-degree camera. Covers a lot more width, and you're looking at it, it's very time efficient, very useful, very potent, very powerful. Needs to be used in the right hands. My goodness, if it's that damn good, how the hell did it not find Dylan Round's body then? Just being honest. Okay, they said they checked the land, the Grangeshed property, and where Dylan Round's body was buried at wasn't on the Grangeshed property. It was on the outside of it, but it really wasn't that far away, right? We can even measure the distance shortly. But moving on to this, another point made from the article in quotes. I believe this was what Candice Cooley said. The Grangeshed property, this is our ground zero. Right here is where it started. So from there, we'll work out our way out with the technology and see if we can find something, said Candice Cooley, Dylan's mum, or not. It just finds it interesting that all these attempts failed. Also that's not to do with the article, that's mentioned by the commenter who was mentioning it. So their opinion was, I just find it interesting that all of these attempts that were conducted failed, all the searches. Also that animal predators didn't discover the shallow grave and dig it up themselves. So just animals in general. Yeah, I get that. So Candice Cooley was saying how the Grangeshed property, the land there, was ground zero, and then they would work their way out. So even if you did check the surrounding land of the Grangeshed property, and with the burial being on the other side of the fence line, if you're branching on out, reaching outwards in different directions, surely it should have been inevitable. Besides that article, there was actual news footage, videos and interviews conducted in the past with Heavy D on site with Candice Cooley, the families, they were piloting the drone and also talking about it, hence the transcript what we read out. And they were at the Grangeshed property as described by Candice Cooley as ground zero. So you got the surrounding land. I can't remember how far it goes in that direction, I'll be honest with you. I'm not quite sure if there is a fence line over here, or at least where it begins, but nevertheless, if I'm looking at it that way, heading west, the fence line reaches this point here, works its way down to here, and then unmarked you see the line which makes its way to the gate there. And to be honest, you probably can follow the fence line as well down this way where it's highlighted in black, which will reach, I believe, this point here and works its way down to here. Possibly, it's hard to tell with it being an odd colour. Does it actually go all the way up there? Well, it might do. What? And then it's there and it works all the way down. It's kind of hard to tell how big the land is. I mean, if you're only looking at it from a certain direction, let's say at the time you were focusing on branching out west, as that's the direction where the phone was disposed in and where Brenner was going later on in the 28th to meet Don Hartley, you'd think maybe one thing could tie with another. With the phone being disposed on that same day, with Brenner going in that direction, then there's a possibility that in that direction Dylan could have been buried as well. And even with that uncertainty, if you're going to branch out north, east, south, west, and you tick it all off the list, did they ever tick off the list of branching out west though, right? Because they said that they did the grid searches, 500 people hand in hand. How did that exactly go? Obviously, if it's just general public hand in hand, they're searching just the surface level. When it comes to actually digging up stuff, they said they turned over the main line of Dylan's farm multiple times, didn't lead to much. Checked the pond multiple times, didn't lead to anything besides the phone. Checked the Grangeshed property multiple times, didn't lead to anything. Checked the dirt mound a few times as well, didn't lead to anything. The surrounding land, they said they checked and used the drones, which are capable of checking for soil disturbance and burials. And yet it was just over that way, 1 mile west on the other side of the property land, right? To be honest, if a drone was used, such as in this spot here, opposite that fence line marker, and it was on the land, if it just so happened to turn the drone facing in this direction, surely just ahead it would have detected disturbance to the soil, the ground. Even if it's on the other side of the fence line, surely even from this distance here, if it's up in the sky, you know, because of the bird's eye perspective, it should have detected it, unless no photos were taken in this particular spot, at this particular distance, at this specific angle. Then it could be a bit odd, because in a way, considering how it's been searched and how things have been worded with time, and they make it seem like quite a lot was done, and, you know, arguably probably a fair bit was done and a lot of effort put in by the family, etc., volunteers, private groups, whatever, agencies. But how can this one spot be missed? If the grain shed property, the land and the surrounding bit is seen as ground zero, and yet it was underneath their nose all this time, I mean, it's weird. It's kind of hard to grasp and comprehend when you've got the right equipment which can do the right job, which can lead to the outcome, and yet it was never successful. Odd. And yet in other cases, this type of equipment and items have been used with more success. So why couldn't it have yielded success here early on? Why did it have to rely on Brenner at the end of the day, considering the actual location of the spot near or at the spot which had already been searched? That's what's weird. And in terms of the distance from, if we're saying that that's the grain shed property land on this side of the line, on the other side wouldn't be owned. If that's truly the case, let me just measure the distance roughly. 0.06 miles. That's crazy. That really is crazy. So I want to know your thoughts. I know, at the end of the day, not much can be done about it, and the main thing is, the main positive, Dylan Rounds has been found, right? But if you ever wanted to be critical, and it went along the lines of, you know what, when it comes to the plea deal and not full justice, because charges being dropped, the desecration charge being dropped to make it look like that Brenner's innocent and didn't bury Dylan, even though Brenner did, because he knew the location and spot. And with the murder charge being dropped from first degree down to second degree, these downgrades kind of take away and diminish what Brenner had actually done in a bad way. It's kind of like minimalising it, which is very unfortunate, and it reduces that justice for Dylan Rounds and even the family as well, seeking full-on closure. If that was a big problem or a big issue, then you would be critical and say, well, if you didn't want that plea deal and for that outcome, if the drowns, maybe the cadaver dogs were used correctly or in the right area, how come they didn't pick up this spot, right? Because if they're dead, it wouldn't have led to a plea deal, and Brenner would have been charged with the original charges, quite likely, or for most part of it. Take in mind that the dogs supposedly were used at Lucin Pond, so depending how they were deployed and which direction they followed, would they have passed by this spot here, or were they deployed from further up that way? Might be the case. Because if dogs did ever pass by, well, they didn't find a spot, did they? And my final question, just to reiterate once again, if at the start with the bloodhound dogs, if they were used, despite the rain and the excuses by the LE saying it would drop down to a 20% chance of success, any chance of success is better than no chance, right? If they were used and deployed right at the beginning, would the dogs have gone to this spot here on screen, which was 0.06 miles away from the actual land of the grain shed property? Or would it have been the same result? Let me know. All in all, hopefully you enjoyed the video and found it somewhat interesting. The importance and focus of this was to acknowledge the anniversary of Dylan Round's death by the hands of James Brenner, but also to retell the original story of how things followed, whilst brushing aside all of the darkness and disruption caused by the problematic humans that engaged within the community, such as on YouTube, etc. Hopefully it made sense. Let me know your thoughts and comments down below in the comment section. If you'd like to check my pinned comment out, you're welcome to do so. If you want to check out recent videos and some additional separate mysteries of high interest and intrigue, click on the top right corner the eye symbol, and then you'll be also able to catch such as the playlist of Dylan Rounds, which I've extensively covered when keeping the case alive and spreading awareness with time. Appreciate people's patience. I'll see you next time. For now, goodbye, good night.